Story 1.
I was in the middle of sorting through boxes of cereal in aisle 6 when I first noticed something wasn't right. The fluorescent lights buzzed above my head, casting that sickly pale glow typical of retail stores at 3 a.m. Being the only overnight stalker at Save Mart wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills while I finished my online degree. That's when I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from somewhere behind the wall of Cheerios boxes. At first, I figured it was just mice. God knows we'd been fighting those little bastards since the store opened. But then a box of Lucky Charms suddenly toppled off the shelf. Not like it was knocked over. It literally flew sideways, landing about 4 feet away from the shelf. I stood there frozen, staring at the scattered rainbow marshmallows on the floor. The scratching had stopped. The only sound was that endless fluorescent buzz and the low hum of the freezers in the distance. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling stupid. Of course, no one would answer. I was alone in the store. Well, except for Marcus at the front register, but he was probably half asleep by now. I pulled out my phone and opened our store's security app. We had cameras covering every aisle, and I wanted to make sure no one was messing with me. The feed showed empty aisles, just rows and rows of products under harsh lighting. But when I got to the camera for aisle 8, my blood ran cold. A dark figure darted across the frame, too quick to make out clearly. "Marcus!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty store. "Can you come check something out?" No response. I walked to the front of the store, my footsteps seeming impossibly loud on the polished floor. The register area was empty. Marcus's jacket was still draped over the back of his chair, and his half-finished Mountain Dew sat on the counter, but he was nowhere to be seen. The scratching sound started again, this time from somewhere above me. I looked up at the drop ceiling, watching a ceiling tile vibrate slightly. Something was moving up there. My first instinct was to run, but I needed this job. If there was some kind of animal in the ceiling, I had to report it. I grabbed my phone again and called Marcus. His phone rang from his jacket pocket. The security feed still showed that figure, now moving between aisles. It seemed to know where the cameras were, always staying just at the edge of their view. I watched as it moved purposefully toward the back of the store. I pulled up the manager's number, but before I could call, all the lights in the store flickered and went out. The emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in a dim red glow. In that moment, I heard footsteps, quick and light, like someone running barefoot, coming from the direction of the loading dock. My heart was pounding as I made my way to the back, using my phone's flashlight. The employee break room door was open, which was weird because I distinctly remembered closing it earlier. Inside, the lockers had been opened. Food wrappers and empty soda cans littered the floor. The scratching sound was louder now, coming from inside the walls. I moved closer, pressing my ear against the cold metal of the lockers. There was definitely something in there, moving through the space between walls. Suddenly my phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "Don't go in the break room. Call 911. I'm locked in the freezer." I ran to the industrial freezer, yanking on the handle. It was stuck. Through the small window, I could see Marcus inside, pounding on the door. His lips were turning blue. I grabbed a mop and tried to wedge it into the doorframe when I heard the barefoot steps again, this time right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the red-tinted darkness. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, rail-thin and dirty, wearing what looked like old Save Mart uniform pieces. Before I could react, it bolted into the ceiling access panel, moving with practiced ease. My hands shaking, I called 911. While I waited for them to arrive, I kept hearing movement in the walls and ceiling, sometimes right above me, sometimes far away. Occasionally, items would fall from shelves in distant aisles. When the police finally arrived, they found Marcus nearly hypothermic but alive. They also found an elaborate nest in the ceiling space above the break room, blankets, food wrappers, and stolen merchandise arranged into a kind of living space. The ceiling and walls were crisscrossed with routes between the store's structural supports, creating a hidden highway through the building. They never caught whoever was living up there. The security footage showed they escaped through the roof access before the cops arrived. But sometimes when I'm working late and hear that scratching sound, I wonder if they ever really left.
Story 2.
I never wanted to move to Henderson Street. The realtor warned me it was scheduled for demolition next year to make way for the new highway expansion, but the price was too good to pass up. As a single mom working 2 jobs, I couldn't afford to be picky. Besides, a year would give me enough time to save up for a better place. The house itself wasn't bad. A typical New England colonial with peeling white paint and creaky hardwood floors. What was unsettling was everything around it. All the neighboring houses had already been torn down, leaving my house standing alone in a sea of empty lots filled with rubble and overgrown weeds. At night, the streetlights cast long shadows across the vacant spaces where homes used to be. The first weird thing I noticed was the landline phone. The previous owners had it disconnected, and I never bothered setting up a new one. But 3 days after we moved in, it started ringing. I remember standing in the kitchen, making mac and cheese for my daughter Emma, when that sharp electronic trill cut through the house. Emma looked up from her coloring book. "Mommy, I thought you said the phone didn't work." I walked over to the old beige handset mounted on the wall. The cord was frayed, the plastic yellowed with age. It rang again. With a shaking hand, I picked it up. Static filled my ear, then a woman's voice, distant and distorted. "Helen? Helen, are you there? They're starting to dig again. You need to stop them before..." The line went dead. I hung up quickly, my heart racing. Helen must have been the previous owner. I tried to convince myself it was just some crossed wires, an old connection, somehow still active. But then the knocking started. It always happened at exactly 3:17 a.m. 3 sharp raps on the front door, like someone using a doorknob to knock. The first time I grabbed my baseball bat and checked. Nothing there except empty lots stretching into darkness. The second time I looked out the upstairs window and saw what looked like a person standing in the empty lot across the street, just staring at our house. When I blinked, they were gone. Emma started seeing things too. She told me about the construction men she saw walking through our yard, carrying tools and clipboards. "They look sad, Mommy," she said. "They keep pointing at the ground." I started researching the street's history. Henderson Street was one of the oldest in town, established in the 1950s when the nearby military research facility was active. The facility closed in 1972 after some kind of accident, but the details were classified. The knocking continued every night. Sometimes we'd hear footsteps on the second floor when we were both downstairs. The landline would ring at random hours, always with the same static-filled calls about the digging and what's buried. I was reaching my breaking point when Mrs. Sullivan, the town librarian, recognized our address. "Oh, the Peterson house, huh?" she said. "That was where they buried the time capsule during the street's founding ceremony. They were supposed to dig it up in 2000, but by then everyone had forgotten about it." I started connecting the dots. The military facility, the mysterious accident, the time capsule. That night I noticed a new construction marker in one of the empty lots. They were starting preliminary work for the highway. Under the beam of my flashlight, I saw something metallic glinting in the freshly disturbed soil. It was a corroded metal capsule, partially exposed by the recent surveying work. Hazmat warnings, faded but still visible, covered its surface. A Geiger counter from my neighbor's father, a geology enthusiast, confirmed my fears. Whatever was in that capsule was leaking, producing electromagnetic interference and releasing God knows what into the air. I called the EPA immediately. They evacuated the entire street and brought in a specialized team. The capsule contained experimental materials from the military facility. Nothing radioactive, thankfully, but chemicals that could cause electromagnetic disruptions and hallucinations when exposed to air. We moved out that week. The haunting made the local papers until the real story came out. The highway project was delayed for environmental cleanup. I still drive by occasionally. Our old house was finally demolished last month, but sometimes when I pass by at night, I swear I can see figures moving through the empty lots, still trying to warn us about what's buried beneath the surface.
Story 3.
I never thought old cassette tapes could freak me out this much. I found them at Mrs. Anderson's garage sale. 3 boxes of unlabeled recordings that she said belonged to her late husband. As a podcast producer always looking for interesting sound bits, I couldn't resist. $5 for the lot. My home studio setup was pretty basic, just some sound equipment crammed into a corner of my basement. But it was perfect for digitizing these tapes. The first few were nothing special, some jazz recordings, a few sermons, what sounded like old radio shows. Then I started hearing the whispers. At first I thought it was bleed-through from the tapes. That happens with old recordings. But these voices seemed to be coming from behind my walls. They started soft, barely audible beneath the hiss of the tapes, but grew clearer each night I worked. The weird thing was, I could only hear them when I was playing the tapes, like they were responding to the recordings. One night, while digitizing what seemed to be an old blues record, a man's voice came through my headphones clear as day. "That's not how it goes, son." I nearly jumped out of my chair. The voice hadn't come from the tape. It was layered over it, like someone speaking into a microphone. I quickly stopped the playback. The basement went silent except for the hum of my equipment. "Hello?" I called out, feeling stupid. My voice echoed off the concrete walls, no response, just the steady red glow of my recording equipment in the darkness. I convinced myself I was imagining things. Too many late nights, too much coffee, too many crime podcasts messing with my head. But when I played the tape again, there it was. Another voice, different this time, humming along with the music. I started recording everything that happened in the studio. The voices seemed more frequent now, commenting on the music, sometimes singing along. They had a weird, hollow quality, like they were coming from far away or from another time. That's when I started researching the house's history. Mrs. Anderson had lived here for 40 years, but before that, nothing special. Just a normal suburban home built in the 1960s. Then I found the blueprints. The town record showed something interesting. The original basement extended another 20 feet past my current wall. But when I measured it out, that extra space wasn't there. Or at least, I couldn't see it. I started tapping the walls while playing the tapes. Most sounded solid, but one spot rang hollow. The voices got louder when I stood near it. It took me 3 days to break through. Behind the drywall, I found another room. A recording studio, untouched for decades. Reel-to-reel machines, mixing boards, microphones hung with cobwebs, and speaker wire. Miles of it, running through the walls like veins. But the strangest part? The equipment was still getting power. I followed the wiring up through the walls. It led to an antenna. Not the normal TV kind, but something bigger, industrial. And it was still connected to the house's electrical system. That night, I sat in the old studio and played one of the tapes. The voices came back clearer than ever. But this time, I understood what was happening. The antenna was picking up signals from WKIT, the radio station 2 miles away. The old wiring in the walls acted like a giant receiver, and something about the combination of the magnetic tape and the powered equipment created audio feedback. But why could I only hear it with these specific tapes? The answer came when I finally met Mrs. Anderson's daughter. "Oh, those tapes," she said. "Dad recorded them all at WKIT. He was the station engineer for 30 years. Had this crazy home studio set up where he could patch into the station's feed. Mom sealed it up after he died. Said it made her too sad to look at. I still have the tapes, but I don't play them anymore." The station switched to digital broadcasting last month, and the voices went quiet. Sometimes, though, late at night, I swear I can hear faint music coming through the walls. echoes of old broadcasts trapped in the wiring of this house waiting for someone to listen.
Story 4.
You think you've seen all kinds of houses doing real estate photography until you run into something like 4873 Palmetto Drive. From the outside, it was your typical Texas ranch-style home. Red brick, well-kept lawn, a rusty basketball hoop over the garage. Nothing special. But then my client mentioned the fallout shelter. Cold War paranoia, Mark, the realtor, laughed as he unlocked the heavy metal door embedded in the backyard. The previous owner was some big shot at Texas Instruments, had this built in 62 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're including it as a unique historical feature in the listing. I should have noticed something was off when the motion detectors in my camera bag started going crazy the moment we opened that door. The shelter entrance was a concrete tube descending at a 45-degree angle with metal steps bolted into the wall. My camera strap kept catching on the handrail as we made our way down, the beam of Mark's flashlight bouncing off the curved walls. "Watch your step," he called back. "Nobody's been down here since the inspection last month." That was the first lie I caught him in. The main room of the shelter was about 20 feet square, with smaller storage rooms branching off. Old civil defense posters hung on the walls, their edges curled with moisture. The air smelled musty, but also like cigarettes? "I'll head back up and check the breaker," Mark said. "Lights should still work." He disappeared up the stairs, leaving me with my camera and LED panel light. I started taking test shots of the main room. Through my viewfinder, I noticed fresh scuff marks on the floor, definitely newer than a month old. And was that a Red Bull can poking out from behind a rusted filing cabinet? The motion detector in my bag started beeping again. I switched off my camera, listening. Something was moving in one of the side rooms. "Mark?" My voice echoed off the concrete. No answer. The sound of shuffling feet came from the storage room to my left. I raised my light, and something darted past the doorway, just a shadow, there and gone. My heart was pounding as I backed toward the stairs. The motion detector was going crazy now, beeping frantically. I heard whispers, then what sounded like laughter, quickly muffled. I reached for the handrail, but my hand met empty air. The stairs were gone. No, not gone. Blocked. While I'd been distracted, a heavy metal shelf had been pushed in front of the entrance. I could see the steps through the gaps, but there was no way I could move the shelf alone. "Hello?" I shouted up the tube. "Mark? I'm trapped down here." More whispers from the storage rooms. My light caught movement, figures ducking between doorways, staying just out of sight. The beeping of the motion detector became constant. "This isn't funny." I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. That's when the light suddenly blazed on, momentarily blinding me. Music started blasting from somewhere, heavy metal distorted through old speakers. Strobe lights I hadn't noticed before began flashing, and smoke started pouring from vents in the ceiling. I crouched in a corner, my heart racing. The shapes moving through the smoke were clearer now. Hooded figures, at least 3 of them, darting between rooms. One stopped and pointed at me, and I heard distinct laughter over the music. Then everything went dark. The silence was absolute. I fumbled for my light, hands shaking. When I switched it on, the shelter was empty. The shelf blocking the stairs had vanished. I ran up those steps faster than I've ever moved in my life. Mark was at the top, looking confused. "Everything okay?" The breaker shot. I pushed past him and didn't stop until I reached my car. 2 days later, my client called. The house hadn't sold because rumors of the haunted shelter were scaring buyers away. But a neighbor had some interesting information. Local teenagers had been breaking in for months, using the shelter for parties. They'd rigged up lights, speakers, and a fog machine, all controlled by a smartphone app. The shelf trick? Part of an elaborate pulley system. The police found their setup exactly as described. Pretty impressive for a bunch of high school kids. They even had a camera to record people's reactions. I still have the photos I took that day. In one of them, partially hidden by smoke, you can see a kid in a black hoodie giving a peace sign to my camera. The house sold last week. I heard the new owners filled in the shelter entrance with concrete. Smart move, if you ask me.